I didn't know saving him would cost me my life as I knew it. The rain came down hard enough to blur the city into streaks of light and shadow, each drop tapping against my windshield like a warning I was too tired to hear. My hands tight around the wheel as I drove home after a 14-hour shift, my body running on coffee and habit more than anything real. The streets nearly empty at that hour except for the occasional passing headlights that vanished as quickly as they appeared. And I remember thinking how quiet everything felt, how the world seemed to pause just long enough for something to go wrong. And then it did, a shape in the road, sudden and impossible, forcing me to slam the brakes, tires skidding just slightly before the car stopped inches away from him. A man collapsed on the wet pavement like he had fallen straight out of the storm itself. And for a second I just sat there, heart racing, staring through the glass, trying to convince myself he wasn't real, that I hadn't almost hit someone in the middle of nowhere. But then he moved, just barely, a shift of his shoulder, a breath that fogged the cold air, and that was enough to pull me out of the car despite every instinct telling me to drive away, to call 911 and stay safe inside. But I didn't. I stepped out into the rain, shoes soaking instantly, my pulse loud in my ears as I approached him slowly, every step heavier than the last. And when I knelt beside him, I saw the truth I wasn't ready for. This wasn't an accident. Nothing about him looked accidental. His clothes too clean, too sharp even in the storm, his presence too controlled even while barely conscious. And when my hands hovered over him, unsure, he suddenly grabbed my wrist with a grip that didn't match his condition, strong, deliberate, his eyes opening just enough to lock onto mine, dark and focused in a way that made my breath catch. And he said it so quietly, I almost missed it. "Don't take me to a hospital." And I froze because that wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. And for a moment I thought about pulling away, about leaving him there and pretending I had never seen him. But something in his voice, something steady beneath the weakness, made me hesitate. And hesitation was all it took for everything to change. I helped him into my car, his weight heavier than expected, his arm draped over my shoulder as I guided him into the passenger seat, my fingers brushing against fabric that felt expensive, out of place for a man lying alone in the rain. And once the door shut and the sound of the storm softened around us, the world felt smaller, tighter, like I had sealed myself into something I didn't understand. I grabbed the first aid kit from the back, my hands moving on instinct, checking him, trying to make sense of what I was seeing without asking too many questions. But questions came anyway, too many of them, none with answers I wanted. And then his phone buzzed, sharp and sudden in the quiet space, lighting up the interior for a split second. A name flashing across the screen that I didn't recognize but somehow knew I should. And before I could look away, before I could pretend I hadn't seen it, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, distant at first, then closer, too fast, cutting through the rain like they were looking for something, or someone. And my stomach dropped because I knew, without knowing how, that it was him they were looking for. And that meant me too now, whether I wanted it or not. I gripped the wheel tighter, my breath shallow as I pressed the gas, the engine responding with a low hum as the car picked up speed, the road stretching out ahead like a line I couldn't turn back from. And beside me he shifted, his voice lower now but clearer, more controlled. "You shouldn't have stopped." And I almost laughed at that, the absurdity of it, because it was too late for that, too late for anything except moving forward. And the headlights behind us stayed, steady, unrelenting, matching every turn, every acceleration. And I realized then that whatever I had stepped into wasn't something I could walk away from. Not tonight, maybe not, ever. And when I finally glanced at him again, really looked this time, I saw something that sent a different kind of chill through me. Not fear exactly, but recognition of something dangerous wrapped in calm, the kind of presence that didn't need to prove itself. And he met my eyes for a brief second, just long enough to say without words what I hadn't wanted to understand. I hadn't just saved a stranger. I had saved someone who lived in a world far darker than mine. And now that world had found me, and it wasn't letting go. "If you keep driving like that, they will not lose us." His voice was steadier now, less like someone barely holding on, and more like someone calculating every second. And that shift alone made my chest tighten, because it meant he was not as weak as he looked, not even close. And I swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the road ahead as the rain kept falling, heavier now, turning the streetlights into long streaks of gold and white that blurred past the windshield. My wipers barely keeping up as I pushed the car faster than I ever had before, 65 miles per hour on a road I usually drove at 40, my hands gripping the wheel, so tightly my fingers started to ache. And still those headlights stayed behind us, steady, patient, like they knew exactly where we were going even though I did not. And that was the part that scared me the most, not the speed, not the storm, but the certainty that this was not random, that this was planned in a way I could not understand. And beside me he shifted again, his shoulder brushing the seat as he leaned back slightly, watching the mirror instead of the road, his breathing more controlled now, more deliberate, and I could feel the change in the air between us, the moment when he stopped being someone I was trying to save and became someone who might not need saving at all. And that realization made something cold settle in my stomach, because if he did not need saving, then what exactly had I just brought into my car? And why did it feel like I was the one in danger now? And as if he could hear the question forming in my mind, he spoke again, quieter this time, but sharper, take the next right. And I blinked, caught off guard, because I had not said anything about where I was going. I had just been driving, instinctively trying to put distance between us and whatever was behind us. And yet he knew, or at least he acted like he did. And for a second I hesitated, my foot easing off the gas just enough to feel the shift, and he turned his head slightly toward me. Not fully, just enough for me to catch his eyes in the reflection of the dashboard lights. And there was something in them that made my hesitation disappear, not fear exactly, not trust either, something else, something heavier, something that felt like a decision I had already made without realizing it. And before I could overthink it, I turned the wheel, the car slipping onto the narrow side street just as the headlights behind us sped past the intersection, not slowing, not turning, continuing straight like we had never been there at all. And for the first time since I had found him on the road, I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, my shoulders dropping slightly as the tension shifted into something quieter but no less intense. And the silence that followed felt louder than the chase had been, the kind of silence that leaves space for questions you are not ready to ask. And I could feel them building anyway, pressing against the back of my throat, demanding to be said. But before I could speak he did. You should not have stopped, he repeated, softer now, almost like a warning instead of a statement. And I shook my head slightly, my eyes still on the road, because what was I supposed to say to that? That I regretted it, that I wished I had driven away, that I had made the wrong choice. None of those felt true. Not completely, because even now, even knowing what I knew, I could not ignore the part of me that had seen him lying there and decided to help anyway. And that part of me was still here, still in control, at least for now. And I finally spoke, my voice quieter than I expected. You would have died out there. And the moment the words left my mouth I wished I could take them back, not because they were wrong, but because of the way he reacted to them, the slight tilt of his head. The almost imperceptible change in his expression, like I had said something naive, something that did not apply to him the way it would to anyone else. And he let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had any warmth in it at all. I do not die that easily, he said. And there it was again, that certainty, that quiet confidence that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And I tightened my grip on the wheel again, because that was not something normal people said, not like that, not without hesitation. And I finally glanced at him fully, really looked at him for the first time since I had pulled him into the car, and now that I was not in the middle of panic, I saw details I had missed before. The way his clothes fit too perfectly to be ordinary, the subtle lines of something expensive in the fabric even though it was damp from the rain, the way he held himself even while injured, not slouched, not collapsed, but controlled, contained, like every movement was intentional. And it hit me all at once. The truth I had been avoiding. This man was not just dangerous because of what was happening tonight, he was dangerous because of who he was. And the phone buzzed again, louder this time in the quiet space, and neither of us moved to answer it. The screen lighting up the interior once more, that same name flashing across it. And I could feel my curiosity pulling at me, demanding to know, but I forced myself to look away, because I already knew enough to be in trouble. I did not need more. And the road ahead curved slightly, leading deeper into a neighborhood I barely recognized, smaller houses, darker streets, fewer lights, and I slowed the car just enough to feel like I had control again, even though I knew I did not. Not really. And after a few more seconds of silence, he spoke again. But this time there was something different in his voice, something almost thoughtful. "You live alone," he said, not asking, stating, and my heart skipped, my eyes snapping toward him before I could stop myself. Because that was not something he should know, not something he could know from what had happened tonight, and I felt the shift again, the balance tipping in a way I did not like, because this was no longer just about helping someone in trouble, this was about being seen in a way I had not agreed to, and I opened my mouth to deny it, to push back, to reclaim some kind of control, but the words never came, because deep down I knew arguing would not change anything, not with someone like him. And he leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes for a moment as if the conversation was already over, as if he had learned everything he needed to know, and the realization settled in my chest, heavy and undeniable. I had not just let him into my car, I had let him into my life, and something told me he was not planning to leave anytime soon. "You should have kept driving." The words stayed in my head long after he said them, echoing louder than the rain still tapping against the roof of my car as I pulled into my apartment complex. The familiar cracked pavement and flickering streetlight somehow feeling foreign now, like I was arriving somewhere I no longer recognized. And I sat there for a second with the engine still running, my hands resting on the steering wheel as I stared ahead, trying to convince myself that if I just stayed still long enough, everything that had happened tonight would undo itself, that he would disappear, that the weight in my chest would lift. But when I finally turned my head, he was still there, still real, still watching me with those calm, unreadable eyes that made it impossible to pretend any of this was temporary. And the silence between us stretched just long enough to feel intentional before he spoke again, softer this time, but no less certain. "This is where you live." And it was not a question, not even close, and something in me tightened because hearing it out loud made it real in a way I could not ignore. And I reached for the door handle before I could think about it too much, because if I hesitated again, I knew I would start asking questions I was not ready to hear answers to. And the moment I stepped out, the cold air hit me, sharp and grounding. The rain lighter now, but still steady enough to cling to my clothes as I moved around to his side of the car, opening the door and bracing myself as he shifted, his weight leaning into me again, heavier now that the adrenaline had faded. And for a second it felt almost normal, helping someone inside, supporting their steps, guiding them carefully across the short distance to my building. Except nothing about this was normal, not the way he moved with controlled precision even while relying on me, not the way his presence filled the space around us like something larger than the moment itself, and definitely not the way my pulse refused to settle no matter how many times. I told myself I was safe, because I was home, because this was my space, my rules, my life. Except it did not feel like mine anymore, not completely. And when we reached my door, I fumbled with my keys just slightly, enough for him to notice, because of course he noticed everything. And I felt his gaze on me as I unlocked it, pushed it open, and stepped inside, flipping on the light as the familiar warmth of my small apartment wrapped around me. The couch I had owned for 3 years, the stack of books on the table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, all of it exactly the same as I had left it, and yet completely different with him standing in the middle of it, taking it in with a single glance like he was memorizing every detail, cataloging it, understanding it in a way that made me uneasy, and I guided him to the couch, easing him down carefully as I stepped back just enough to create space, to breathe, to remind myself that I was still in control of something, anything, and I moved quickly after that, grabbing clean towels, the rest of my first aid supplies, focusing on the routine, the steps I knew, because routine felt safe. It felt like something I could rely on when everything else was shifting around me, and I knelt in front of him, my hands steady even though my thoughts were not, working carefully, deliberately, refusing to let my mind wander too far into questions I could not answer. And for a while neither of us spoke, the only sound the soft rustle of fabric and the quiet rhythm of his breathing. And I told myself that silence meant safety, that if we did not say anything, then maybe the situation would stay contained, manageable. But then he broke it. Of course he did, because silence was never something he allowed to last. "You do not ask questions," he said, his voice low but clear, and I paused for just a second, my hands stilling before I forced them to move again. because the truth was I had questions, too many of them. But I also had the instinct, the very strong instinct, that asking them would lead me somewhere I did not want to go. And I let out a small breath, keeping my eyes on what I was doing as I answered, maybe I already know enough. And that earned a reaction, not a big one, just a slight shift in his posture, a subtle change in the way he looked at me, like I had said something unexpected, something that did not fit whatever expectation he had formed about me. And for a brief moment, the tension between us changed, not gone, never gone, but different, less sharp, more complicated, and I finished what I was doing, setting the supplies aside as I stood, stepping back again, creating distance because I needed it, because being that close to him made everything feel too intense, too immediate. And I crossed my arms without thinking, a small protective gesture that I hoped he would not notice. But of course he did, and his gaze followed the movement before returning to my face, steady, assessing. And then he said something that made my breath catch again. You are not afraid of me. And it was not a question, just an observation. And I opened my mouth to deny it, to say something logical, something safe. But the words did not come out right, because the truth was more complicated than that. I was afraid, but not in the way I expected, not in the way I should have been, and that realization unsettled me more than anything else that had happened tonight. And I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him, because I did not have a better answer, and he watched me for a second longer before leaning back into the couch, his eyes closing briefly as if the conversation was already finished, as if he had learned everything he needed to know from my silence. And I stood there, in my own apartment, feeling like a guest in my own life, realizing slowly, piece by piece, that this was not just a moment, not just a single night that would pass and be forgotten. This was the beginning of something I could not control, something that had already taken hold the second I stepped out of my car in the rain. And now that it was here, sitting in my living room, breathing in the same space as me, I understood something I had not been ready to admit before. I had not just saved him. I had invited him in, and he was not the kind of man who ever left when he was invited. You should get some rest. His voice cut through the quiet like it belonged there, like he had always been part of this space. And that alone made something tighten in my chest, because it had only been minutes, maybe an hour at most, and yet it already felt like he had rearranged the air around me, like the apartment itself had adjusted to his presence. And I blinked, pulling myself back from that thought as I turned toward the kitchen, needing distance even if it was only a few steps, needing something familiar to hold onto. And I grabbed a glass of water from the counter, my hands moving automatically, routine again, something simple, something I could control. And when I turned back, he was watching me, not casually, not absent-mindedly, but with that same focused attention that made me feel like I was being read instead of seen. And I walked back slowly, setting the glass down on the table in front of him, careful not to get too close this time, careful to keep that thin line of space between us that I was starting to realize mattered more than I wanted it to. And he did not reach for the water immediately. He just looked at it, then at me, like he was deciding something I could not hear, and the silence stretched again, heavier now, filled with everything neither of us was saying. And I shifted my weight slightly, crossing my arms again without meaning to, and he noticed, of course he noticed, his gaze flicking to the movement before returning to my face. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, almost thoughtful. You were trying to understand me. And I let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a sigh, because that was exactly what I had been trying not to do. I shook my head slightly, my voice softer than I intended. I am trying not to. And that seemed to interest him more than anything else I had said so far, his head tilting just a fraction, his expression unreadable but engaged, like I had given him something unexpected again. And for a moment neither of us moved, the space between us holding steady. And then he finally reached for the glass, his fingers brushing the edge lightly. Before lifting it, his movements controlled, deliberate. Even something as simple as drinking water carried a kind of precision that felt out of place in my small, cluttered living room. And I watched him without meaning to, noticing the details I had missed before. The way his presence did not shrink to fit the space. It filled it, expanded it, made everything else feel smaller by comparison. And I realized then that this was not just about who he was out there, in whatever world he came from. This was who he was everywhere, always. And that realization made me step back again, unconsciously putting more distance between us as I moved toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just slightly to glance out at the parking lot. The rain still falling, softer now, the streetlight casting long shadows across the pavement, and for a second everything looked normal again, quiet, still, untouched, and I almost convinced myself that the night had settled, that whatever had followed us was gone, that I could breathe again. But then I saw it, a car parked farther down, engine off, lights dark, but positioned just enough to feel intentional, and my stomach tightened as I let the curtain fall back into place, my hand lingering on the fabric for a second before I turned around slowly. And he was already watching me, already knowing, "You saw something," he said, not asking, and I nodded before I could stop myself. The motion small but enough, and he leaned forward slightly, the shift. In his posture immediate, focused, "What kind of car?" And I hesitated, not because I did not want to answer, but because answering meant acknowledging that whatever this was had followed us here, into my home, into my space, and that thought made everything feel smaller, tighter, harder to escape. But I answered anyway, my voice low, "Dark sedan, no lights, parked at the far end," and he was silent for a second, just a second, but it was enough to feel like he was recalculating something, adjusting a plan I had never been part of, and then he stood, and that was the moment everything shifted again, because until now he had been sitting, contained, manageable in a way that made this feel almost temporary, but standing, he was something else entirely, taller, more present, more impossible to ignore, and my breath caught slightly as he took a step toward the door, his movements steady despite everything. Like whatever had happened earlier had already been pushed aside, and I instinctively moved, not forward, not toward him, but slightly to the side, giving him space without thinking about it. And he paused just long enough to glance at me, his eyes sharp again, focused in a way that made my pulse quicken. "You stay here," he said, and it was not a suggestion, not even close, and something in me reacted to that, something that did not like being told what to do in my own home, and I crossed my arms tighter, my voice sharper than before. "This is my apartment," and for a second, just a second, something almost like amusement flickered across his expression, brief, subtle, gone before I could fully recognize it, and he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space completely, but enough to make the air shift again, enough to remind me how easily he could, and his voice dropped slightly, lower, more controlled. "Exactly." And that single word carried more weight than anything else he had said tonight, because it was not just agreement, it was acknowledgement, ownership of the situation, not of me, not yet, but of everything else, the space, the moment, the reality we were standing in, and I held his gaze for a second longer than I should have, something in me refusing to look away, refusing to give in to the tension that kept building between us, and then he turned, reaching for the door, his movements smooth, certain, like he had already decided what came next, and I stood there, frozen in place, listening as the door opened, the sound of the rain slipping back into the apartment for just a moment before it closed again, behind him, and the silence that followed was different this time, heavier, louder, filled with the absence of him in a way I was not prepared for, and I moved slowly, almost without thinking, stepping toward the window again, pulling the curtain back just enough to see. And there he was, standing under the dim light, his figure steady, controlled, facing the direction of that parked car, and even from this distance, even through the rain and the glass, I could feel it, the shift in the air, the way everything seemed to center around him, like the night itself was waiting. And for the first time since I had found him on that road, I realized something I had not allowed myself to fully understand before. This was not just about him being in danger. This was about him being the kind of danger that did not stay contained, the kind that followed you home, stepped into your life, and changed it without asking. And as I stood there watching him in the rain, I knew, without knowing how, that whatever happened next, there was no going back to who I had been before tonight. This is where you decide if you trust me or not. His voice carried through the door even though it was closed, low and steady, as if the walls of my apartment were not meant to keep him out or in, just to echo whatever he chose to say, and I stood there for a second, frozen, my hand still resting against the curtain, as I tried to process the fact that he had spoken to me without turning, without seeing me, like he already knew exactly where I was standing. And something about that unsettled me more than the car outside, more than the rain, more than anything that had happened so far, because it meant he was always aware, always in control, even when I thought I had a moment to myself. And I swallowed, forcing myself to step back from the window, to move, to do something other than stand there watching him like I was waiting for permission to breathe. And I paced once across the room, then again, my thoughts moving faster than my body, trying to catch up, trying to make sense of what I was supposed to do next, because this was no longer just about helping someone for one night. This had crossed into something else entirely, something that had rules I did not understand and consequences I could not see yet. And my eyes drifted back to the door, to the thin barrier separating me from whatever he was doing out there. And for a second, I thought about ignoring him, about locking the door and pretending none of this was my problem anymore. But that thought did not last. It never really had a chance, because deep down I knew that choice had already passed, somewhere between stopping the car and letting him inside. And now I was standing in the middle of something I could not step out of just by wishing it away. And the silence stretched again, heavy, waiting, and I exhaled slowly before moving toward the door, my hand hovering over the handle for just a second before I turned it, pulling it open just enough to see the cool air brushing against my skin as the rain continued to fall. Softer now, almost quiet compared to before, and he was still there, exactly where I had seen him, standing under the dim light, his posture unchanged, his focus fixed on that car at the far end of the lot. And I stepped out carefully, the door closing behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. And for a moment, I just stood there beside him, not speaking, not moving closer, just existing in the same space, feeling the difference immediately. The way everything seemed sharper out here, the air, the sound of rain, the tension that lingered between us like something alive. And he did not look at me right away, his attention still forward, still locked onto whatever he was watching. And I followed his gaze, trying to see what he saw, trying to understand what made that car different from any other parked vehicle. But all I saw was stillness, darkness, nothing obvious, nothing I could point to and say this is the problem. And yet I felt it anyway, the same way I had felt it on the road, the certainty that something was off, that something was waiting. And after a few seconds he spoke again, quieter now, almost like he was thinking out loud. They are patient. And I frowned slightly, my eyes still on the car, trying to process what that meant, before I asked, my voice low, "Who are they?" And that was the first real question I had asked him all night, the first time I had stepped past the line I had been holding. And for a moment I thought he might ignore it, might let it hang there unanswered. But then he turned his head just slightly, enough for me to see his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the calm in his expression that did not match the situation at all. And he answered in a way that did not really answer anything. People who do not like losing control. And I let out a small breath, something between frustration and disbelief, because that could have meant anything. And I turned to look at him fully, my voice a little sharper now. That does not help me. And this time he did look at me, directly, fully, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made everything else fade for just a second. The rain, the car, the night, all of it disappearing under the weight of that gaze. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "You are not supposed to be helped," he said. And I blinked, caught off guard by the phrasing, because it felt less like information and more like a statement about something bigger than either of us. And I shook my head slightly, trying to ground myself, trying to pull the conversation back to something I could understand. "I am not asking about me," I said. "I am asking about you." And something shifted then, subtle but real, like I had stepped into a space he had not expected me to enter. And for a second he just looked at me, studying, measuring, deciding something I could not hear. And then he exhaled slowly, his gaze moving back to the car before he spoke. "My name is Adrian." And the simplicity of it, the directness, caught me off guard more than anything else he had said so far, because up until now everything about him had been controlled, layered, indirect. And this was not that. This was straightforward, clear, intentional. And I felt something in my chest shift in response, something I could not quite name, and I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him. "Emily," I said, even though he already knew, even though that part had never really been a mystery. And for a moment the tension between us softened, just slightly, just enough to feel human, like we were two people standing in the rain instead of two forces colliding in a way neither of us fully understood. But that moment did not last. It never did, because the world around us had not changed. The car was still there. The night was still watching. And Adrian's posture shifted again, his focus sharpening, his attention narrowing, and I followed his gaze once more, my breath catching slightly as I noticed something I had missed before, a faint movement inside the car, barely visible. Just enough to confirm what I had already felt, that we were not alone, that we had never been alone, and the realization settled heavy in my chest as Adrian spoke again, his voice calm, certain, like he had already made a decision I was only now beginning to understand. Go back inside, Emily. And this time I did not argue, because something in the way he said my name made it clear, whatever happened next was not something I was meant to stand in the middle of. But as I turned toward the door, my hand reaching for the handle once more, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no longer just his world. It had already become mine too. Sometimes walking away is the most dangerous thing you can do. His words followed me inside even after the door closed, settling into the quiet of my apartment like they belonged there, like they had been waiting for me long before tonight. And I stood with my back against the door for a second, my hand still on the handle, listening to the rain, to the faint echo of my own breathing, to the absence of everything else, and it felt wrong. Too still, too quiet compared to the tension outside, like the calm before something I could not see yet, and I pushed myself away from the door slowly, forcing my feet to move, to cross the small space of my living room as if I still had control over it, as if this was still just my apartment and not a place that had suddenly become part of something bigger, something I did not understand. And I glanced toward the window again without meaning to, the curtains still slightly open from before, and even though I told myself not to look, not to get pulled back into whatever was happening out there, I stepped closer anyway, drawn by something I could not ignore, and when I looked, the scene had shifted just enough to make my chest tighten. The car was still there, still dark, still waiting, but Adrian was no longer standing in the same spot. He had moved, just a few steps, positioning himself in a way that felt deliberate, like he was controlling the space between them without ever getting too close. And even from here, even through the glass and the rain, I could see it, the difference in him, the way his posture had changed, sharper now, more focused, like whatever version of him had been sitting on my couch was gone, replaced by something else entirely, something that did not hesitate, did not question. And I wrapped my arms around myself without realizing it. A small instinctive movement as I watched, my breath shallow as seconds stretched longer than they should have. And then the car door opened, slow, measured, and someone stepped out, a figure in the dim light, indistinct but purposeful, and my heart started to race again, the same way it had on the road, the same way it had every time something shifted beyond my control, and I leaned closer to the glass without meaning to, trying to see more, to understand. But there was not much to see. Just two figures standing in the rain, facing each other, not moving closer, not speaking loud enough for me to hear, just existing in that space with a kind of tension that felt heavier than distance. And I realized then that whatever was happening out there was not chaotic, not random. It was controlled, intentional, like a conversation that did not need words. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant Adrian was not reacting. He was anticipating, he was choosing. And I stepped back from the window suddenly, the feeling too much, too overwhelming, and I paced once across the room again, my thoughts spinning faster now, trying to catch up with a situation that kept moving without me, and I stopped near the kitchen counter, gripping the edge lightly as I took a breath, trying to steady myself, trying to remember that I was still me, that I still had a life outside of this night, outside of him, but even that felt distant now, like something that had already started to fade, and I closed my eyes for a second, just 1 second, but it was enough for his voice to come back, clear, steady, unavoidable. Go back inside, Emily, and I exhaled slowly, opening my eyes again as I looked toward the door, because I had done that. I had listened, and yet it did not feel like safety. It felt like waiting, and I hated waiting, especially when I did not know what I was waiting for. And before I could stop myself, I moved again, back toward the door, my hand reaching for the handle without hesitation this time, because something in me refused to stay out of it completely, refused to pretend that I was not already involved, and I opened it just enough to step out again. The rain colder now against my skin, sharper, more real, and I stopped just outside, not walking all the way toward them, not crossing that invisible line, but close enough to see more clearly now, to understand just a little more. And Adrian did not turn right away, but I knew he was aware of me. I could feel it, the same way I had before, like his attention extended beyond where he was looking, and the other figure shifted slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of their face in the dim light, but not enough to recognize anything, just enough to confirm that this was real, that this was happening. And then Adrian spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying just enough to reach me even through the rain. "You came alone." And there was something in the way he said it that made my breath catch, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied: expectation, certainty. And the other figure responded, their voice quieter, harder to make out, but I caught enough to understand the tone. Not fear, not aggression, something else, something careful. And I realized then that this was not a confrontation, not the way I had imagined it. This was something more precise, more calculated. And Adrian took a step forward, just one, closing a small part of the distance between them, and everything in me tensed, waiting for something I could not name. And then he said something that made everything shift again, softer now, almost calm. "You should have left when you had the chance." And the words hung in the air between them, heavy, final, and for a second nothing moved, nothing changed, the rain continuing to fall, the night holding its breath, and I stood there, just outside my own door, realizing with a clarity that made my chest tighten that this was no longer something I could watch from a distance. This was something I was already standing inside, and whatever happened next was going to reach me whether I wanted it to or not. "You are closer than you think." I did not realize he was speaking to me until his head turned slightly, not fully, just enough for his voice to reach where I stood, and the words landed heavier than they should have, settling somewhere deep in my chest as the rain continued to fall around us, steady, relentless, like it was marking time for something neither of us could stop. And I froze for a second, my feet rooted to the wet pavement just outside my own door. Because he was right. I was closer than I had ever intended to be. Not just physically, not just standing a few yards away from whatever this was, but inside it, pulled into a moment that was no longer separate from me. And the figure across from him shifted again, a small movement, cautious, measured, like they were weighing every second, every word, and I could feel the tension tightening in the space between them, not explosive, not chaotic, but controlled, like something held on a thin line that could snap if pushed too far. And Adrian took another step forward, slow, deliberate, closing the distance just enough to make it clear that he was not the one retreating, not the one waiting. And even from here, even with the rain distorting everything slightly, I could see the difference in him, the way his presence filled the space completely, like there was no room left for uncertainty. And the other figure responded with a step of their own, not forward, not back, just a shift, enough to maintain that balance. And I realized then that this was not about movement, it was about control, about who held it and who did not. And Adrian spoke again, his voice low but clear, "You were told to stay away." And the response came after a pause, quieter, but firm enough to carry, "Things change." And that simple exchange made something in me tighten, because it sounded like history, like something that had been building long before tonight, something I had walked into without knowing. And I took a small step forward without thinking, just one, enough to feel the rain soak through my sleeve, enough to bring me closer to the edge of whatever this was. And Adrian's head turned slightly again, just enough to acknowledge me without breaking his focus. "Go back inside, Emily," he said, and this time there was something different in his voice, not just command, not just control, something else, something that almost sounded like concern. And that stopped me more than anything else, because it did not fit with everything else I had seen from him. It did not match the calm, calculated presence he carried. And I hesitated, caught between stepping back and staying where I was, because neither option felt right anymore, not after everything that had happened. And the other figure noticed. I could tell by the way their posture shifted, their attention flicking toward me for just a second before returning to Adrian. And that was enough to make everything sharper, more immediate, because now I was not just watching. I was part of the space they were both aware of, and Adrian's Voice dropped slightly, quieter now, but more intense. This does not involve her. And the way he said it made my breath catch, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied, that there was something to involve, something larger, something I was being kept out of intentionally. And the other figure responded, a faint edge in their tone now. She is already involved. And that hit harder than anything else, because it was true, undeniable, unavoidable, and I felt it settle into me. The realization that there was no line I could step back across, no version of this where I returned to being separate from whatever this was. And Adrian did not respond immediately, just stood there for a second, the rain falling around him, his posture still, controlled. And then he spoke again, softer this time, but with a finality that left no room for argument, not by my choice. And that was it. That was the moment everything shifted again, because it was not just a statement, it was a line drawn, a boundary set in a world I did not understand, and the other figure seemed to recognize it, their posture relaxing just slightly, not in defeat, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like something had been decided without needing to be said directly. And the silence that followed felt different, less tense, but heavier in a way I could not explain, like the air itself had thickened around us, and I stood there, caught in it, my heart still racing, my thoughts trying to catch up with a situation that kept moving ahead of me. And Adrian finally turned fully this time, his gaze landing on me with a focus that made everything else fade again, just for a second, and he held it there, steady, unbreaking, like he was making sure I understood something without saying it out loud. And then he spoke, quieter now, but clear enough to reach me. Go inside, lock the door, and do not open it for anyone but me. And there was something in the way he said it that made my hesitation disappear, not because I wanted to obey, not because I felt controlled, but because I understood, on some level I could not explain, that this was not a suggestion, it was protection. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else, because I did not know what it meant to be protected by someone like him. And I nodded slightly before turning, my steps slower this time, heavier, like each one was taking me further into something I could not see the end of. And when I reached the door, I paused for just a second, my hand on the handle, my thoughts spinning, and then I went inside, closing it behind me, the sound louder than it should have been, final in a way that made my chest tighten. And I leaned against it again, just for a moment, listening to the rain, to the silence, to everything that was happening just beyond the wall. And I realized then, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, this was no longer about whether I trusted him or not. This was about the fact that I already had, without even realizing it, the moment I chose to stay. The silence is worse when you know something is happening. I pressed my back against the door, my hand still resting on the lock like it was the only thing holding my world together. And for a moment I just stood there, listening, not to anything specific, just to the absence of sound inside my apartment compared to the weight of everything happening outside. And it felt wrong, like the quiet was too clean, too untouched, like it did not belong to the same night anymore. And I forced myself to move, stepping away from the door slowly, my eyes drifting toward the window again, even though I told myself not to look, not to get pulled back into it. But I did anyway, because not knowing felt worse than knowing, and I reached for the curtain, pulling it back just a fraction, enough to see without fully exposing myself. And the scene outside had shifted again, the two figures still there, but closer now, not by much, just enough to change the tension between them, to make it feel more immediate, more personal. And Adrian stood exactly the same way, controlled, steady, like the rain did not touch him at all, like the night itself adjusted around him instead of the other way around. And the other figure moved slightly, their posture less guarded now, but not relaxed, never relaxed. And I could tell they were speaking again even though I could not hear the words, their movements small, deliberate, like every second was measured. And I leaned closer without realizing it, my breath shallow as I tried to catch even a fragment of what was being said. But the glass and the rain kept it just out of reach, like the world outside was intentionally keeping its secrets from me. And frustration built slowly in my chest, because I was here, I was part of this now, and yet I still did not understand what I had stepped into. And I let the curtain fall back slightly, pacing once across the room before returning again, unable to stay away, drawn back to the window like something inside me refused to let this unfold without me witnessing it. And when I looked again, Adrian had moved, just one step, but it was enough to shift everything, enough to change the distance between them in a way that felt final, like a decision had been made, and the other figure stilled, completely, as if they were waiting, and I felt it again, that same tightening in my chest, that same sense that something was about to happen even if I did not know what, and I held my breath without meaning to, my fingers pressing lightly against the glass as if that would bring me closer, as if that would make it clearer, and then Adrian spoke. His voice faint, but just enough to reach me this time. Carried by the break in the rain. You were given a chance, and the words settled into me before I could process them, before I could understand why they mattered, and the response came after a pause, quieter, almost resigned. Some chances are not real, and that made something shift inside me, because it sounded less like a threat and more like truth, something deeper, something that had nothing to do with me, and yet somehow affected me. Anyway, and Adrian did not respond immediately, just stood there, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and then he stepped back, just slightly, and the movement felt deliberate, controlled, like he was creating space instead of closing it, and the other figure seemed to understand, their shoulders lowering just a fraction, their stance less rigid, and I realized then that this was not what I had expected, not a confrontation, not something explosive, but something quieter, something more precise, like a negotiation that had already reached its conclusion before I even knew it had begun, and the tension in my chest shifted, not gone, never gone, but different, less sharp, more uncertain, and I leaned back from the window slightly, my mind trying to catch up, trying to understand what this meant, what it changed, and for a second I let myself believe that maybe this was over, that maybe whatever had followed us here was leaving, that maybe I could breathe again, but then Adrian turned, not toward the car, not toward the other figure, but toward my apartment, toward me, and even through the distance, even through the glass, I felt it, the way his attention locked onto where I stood, like he could see through everything between us, like there was no barrier at all, and my breath caught again, my hand tightening slightly on the curtain as I held still, waiting, and the other figure stepped back, slow, deliberate, returning toward the car without another word, without another movement, like whatever had needed to be said had already been said, and I watched as they disappeared inside, the door closing quietly, the engine starting a few seconds later, low and steady, and the car pulled away, slowly at first, then faster as it reached the end of the lot, disappearing into the night like it had never been there at all, and the moment it was gone, the space felt different, lighter in a way that made me realize just how heavy it had been before, and I exhaled slowly, my shoulders dropping as the tension eased just enough to let me think again, and Adrian remained where he was for a second longer, watching the empty space where the car had been, before turning fully toward the building, toward me, and I stepped back from the window quickly, my heart racing again for a completely different reason now, because whatever had just ended outside was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something else, something closer, something that was about to step back through my door, and I moved toward it instinctively, my hand hovering over the lock as I listened for his steps, the faint sound of them approaching through the rain, steady, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. And when the knock came, soft but certain, I realized something I had not fully understood until that moment. The danger outside had left, but the one inside my life had just begun. You always have a choice, until you do not. His voice came through the door before I even turned the lock, low and steady, like he had been standing there long enough to know exactly what I was thinking, and my hand froze on the handle for just a second, the weight of everything that had happened settling into that single moment, because opening the door meant letting him back in, not just physically, but into whatever was left of my normal life, and I hesitated, just for a breath, before I turned the lock and pulled the door open, and he stood there exactly as I expected, rain still clinging to his jacket. His expression calm, unchanged, like nothing outside had required effort, like it had all gone exactly the way he intended, and for a second neither of us spoke, the space between us filled with something heavier than silence, something that had been building all night, and then he stepped inside without asking, not forcefully, not abruptly, just with quiet certainty, like this was already his place to enter, and I moved back automatically, giving him space without thinking, closing the door behind him as the sound of the rain faded once again, leaving us alone in the quiet that felt different now, less safe, more aware, and he paused just inside, his gaze moving across the room briefly before settling on me again, steady, focused, like nothing about this space distracted him from whatever he was measuring in me. And I crossed my arms without meaning to, the same instinctive movement from before, something to hold on to, something to remind myself that I was still here, still in control of something, even if it did not feel like much. And he noticed, of course he noticed, his eyes flicking to the gesture before returning to my face. And then he spoke, softer this time, but no less certain. They will not come back tonight. And I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, the tension in my shoulders easing just slightly, not gone, never gone, but enough to make me feel the difference. And I nodded slowly, my voice quieter than I expected. How do you know? And he held my gaze for a second before answering. Because they already got what they needed, and that did not make me feel better, not even close, because I did not know what that meant, what they had taken, what had changed, and I felt that familiar frustration rise again. The one that came from standing in the middle of something without understanding it. And I shook my head slightly, my voice firmer now. That does not explain anything. And for a moment I thought he might deflect again, might give me another answer that sounded like one but was not. But instead he stepped closer, not too close, just enough to shift the space between us, to make it clear that this conversation mattered, and his voice dropped slightly, more direct now. You are safe because they saw me leave your car. And the words landed harder than anything else he had said, because they connected everything, the road, the chase, the car outside, all of it threading together into something I could finally understand, and my stomach tightened as the realization settled in. They know I was with you, I said, and he did not hesitate. Yes, and the simplicity of it made it worse, made it heavier, because there was no room to pretend, no way to step back from that truth, and I turned away slightly, pacing once across the room, my mind racing as I tried to process what that meant, what it changed, and I stopped near the kitchen again, my hands resting against the counter as I stared down at nothing, because suddenly my apartment did not feel like a place anymore. It felt like a point on a map I did not know I was on. And I let out a breath, slower this time, trying to steady myself, trying to find something solid to hold on to. And I spoke again, quieter now. What happens next? And there it was. The question I had been avoiding all night. The one that meant I was no longer pretending this would end when he left. And the room felt still for a second, like it was waiting for his answer. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled. But there was something underneath it now. Something that felt almost personal. They will watch. And I closed my eyes briefly, just for a second. Because that was exactly what I had feared. Not an immediate threat, not something obvious, but something slower. Something that would stay, that would linger in ways I could not see, and I nodded once, more to myself than to him, because that made sense in the worst way, and I turned back to face him, my voice steadier now, even if I did not feel it. And what about you? And that was different. That question carried weight in a way the others had not, because it was not just about the situation, it was about him, about where he stood in all of this. And he held my gaze again, longer this time, like he was deciding how much to say, how much to give, and then he answered, simply, I do not get watched. And something in the way he said it made me believe him, not because it sounded reassuring, but because it sounded like fact, like something that had been proven over time, and I felt that shift again, that strange pull between fear and something else I could not name, and I crossed my arms tighter, trying to ground myself, trying to stay in the part of this that made sense, and I shook my head slightly. That does not help me. And for a brief moment, something almost like understanding flickered across his expression, subtle, but real, and he stepped closer again, just enough to close the space between us in a way that felt intentional, and his voice softened, not weaker, not uncertain, just quieter, more focused. Then you stay with me. And the words hung there, simple, direct, impossible to ignore, and my breath caught as I stared at him, because that was not a suggestion, not really. It was a solution presented like a fact, and everything in me reacted at once, hesitation, resistance, something deeper that I could not quite define, and I shook my head instinctively, taking a small step back. That is not how this works, I said. But even as I said it, I knew something had already shifted, Something had already moved past the point of how things were supposed to work, and he watched me, steady, unchanging, like he was waiting for me to catch up to that realization on my own. And the silence stretched between us again, but this time it felt different, less uncertain, more inevitable, and I understood then, with a clarity that made my chest tighten. This was not about whether I would be pulled deeper into his world. That had already happened. This was about whether I would choose how it happened next. You think this is about choice, but it stopped being about choice the moment you stepped out of that car. His voice was calm, almost quiet, but the weight of his words pressed into me harder than anything else he had said tonight, and I stood there, a few feet away from him in my own living room, trying to hold on to something that still felt like mine, something that had not already shifted under my feet, but the truth was becoming impossible to ignore, because every step I had taken since the rain started had led me here, to this moment, to him, and I let out a slow breath, shaking my head slightly as I forced myself to meet his gaze, because looking away felt like giving in to something I was not ready to accept, not yet, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. Even if my chest felt tight, I did not agree to any of this, and for a second he just watched me, not dismissing it, not arguing, just taking it in like he was measuring the space between what I was saying and what was actually true. And then he took a step closer, not aggressive, not rushed, just deliberate, like everything else he did, and the air shifted again, that same subtle change that made everything feel more focused, more immediate, and his voice dropped slightly, quieter now, but more direct. You agreed when you stayed, and I felt that land, not because I wanted it to, but because part of me knew there was truth in it, even if I did not like it, even if I did not want to admit it, and I crossed my arms tighter, my instinct pushing back even as my thoughts struggled to keep up. Staying is not the same as choosing, I said, and something flickered in his expression, brief, almost imperceptible, like I had said something that mattered, something he was not expecting, and he tilted his head slightly, studying me again, really studying me this time, like he was trying to understand something beyond the situation, beyond the obvious, and the silence stretched between us, not empty, but filled with something heavier, something that felt like a shift happening beneath the surface, and I felt it too. The moment where this stopped being just about survival, just about getting through the night, and started becoming something else, something more complicated, more personal, and I took a small step back without meaning to, needing space, needing to think, and I turned slightly, pacing once across the room before stopping near the edge of the kitchen again, my fingers brushing against the counter as I tried to ground myself, trying to remember who I was before all of this, before him. And I spoke again, quieter now, but more focused. If they are watching me, then staying here is not safe. And that felt logical. That felt like something I could hold on to, something that made sense in a way everything else did not. And for a second I thought he might agree, might adjust, might offer something different. But instead he shook his head once, slow, certain. It is safer than anywhere else you can go. And I turned back toward him, frustration rising again, because that answer only deepened everything. It did not resolve anything. And I stepped forward this time, closing a small part of the distance between us, my voice sharper now. You do not know that. And this time he did not step closer. He did not shift the space between us. He just held his ground, his gaze steady, unwavering. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was something underneath it now, something firmer, something that did not leave room for doubt. I do. And the certainty in that single statement made something in me falter, just for a second, because it was not arrogance, it was not a guess, it was knowledge. The kind that came from experience I did not have, from a world I did not understand, and I felt that realization settle into me. Heavy, uncomfortable, and I exhaled slowly, my shoulders dropping just slightly as I tried to process it, trying to find where I stood in all of this, and I shook my head again, softer this time, more to myself than to him. This is not my world, and that was the truth. The one thing I could still say with certainty, and for a moment I thought he might agree, might acknowledge that difference. But instead he stepped closer again, closing the space between us in a way that felt intentional, controlled, and his voice softened, not weaker, but quieter, more precise. It is now. And the words hit harder than anything else, because they were not forceful, not threatening, just stated like fact, like something that had already happened whether I accepted it or not. and I felt my breath catch as I looked at him, really looked at him, trying to understand how someone could say something like that with such certainty, and part of me wanted to argue, wanted to push back, to hold on to the version of my life that had existed before tonight. But another part of me, the part that had stepped out into the rain, the part that had led him into my car, into my apartment, into this moment, knew that line had already been crossed, and the silence stretched again. But this time it felt different, less like a pause and more like a decision waiting to be made, and I felt it building, the weight of it, the inevitability of it. And I finally spoke, my voice quieter now, but clearer, more certain than before. If I stay, this does not go back to normal. And that was not a question. It was an acknowledgement, a line I was finally seeing clearly, and he held my gaze, steady, unflinching, and after a second he answered, simply, no. And there it was, the truth, unfiltered, unavoidable, and I nodded slowly, because that was what I needed, not comfort, not reassurance, just clarity, and I took a breath, deeper this time, steadying myself as I let the reality settle in, because this was the moment, the one where everything shifted from something happening to me into something I had to choose how to face. And I looked at him again, my voice steady despite everything. Then you do not get to decide for me. And something changed then, subtle but real, like the balance between us adjusted, like I had stepped into a space he had not expected me to claim, and he watched me for a second, longer this time, and then, just slightly, he nodded, not in agreement, not fully, but in acknowledgement, like he recognized the shift, like he understood that whatever happened next was no longer just his decision, and the air between us settled into something new, something quieter, but no less intense, and I realized then, with a clarity that steadied me more than anything else had tonight, this was not about escaping his world anymore. This was about how I would stand inside it. You are not as fragile as you think. His voice was quieter this time, not commanding, not pushing, just stating something like he had already seen it proven, and I stood there across from him, feeling the weight of everything that had been said settle into the space between us, different now, steadier, like the chaos of the night had shifted into something more controlled, more deliberate, and I exhaled slowly, my arms still crossed, but less tightly than before, because something inside me had changed, something that was no longer just reacting, no longer just trying to survive the moment, and I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, but in disbelief at how quickly everything had shifted. A few hours ago, I was driving home thinking about nothing more than sleep, and now I was standing in my living room negotiating my place in a world I did not even know existed. And I let out a small breath, my voice softer now, but more grounded. You do not know me. And for the first time since I had met him, he did not answer immediately. He just watched me, his gaze steady, thoughtful in a way that felt different from before, less like he was assessing and more like he was considering. And then he spoke, low and certain, I know what you chose, and that hit in a way I was not expecting, because it was true, undeniable. I had chosen to stop, to help, to stay. And even now I was still here, still standing in front of him instead of walking away. And I felt that realization settle into me, not heavy this time, but grounding, like something I could actually hold on to. And I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him, because there was no point in denying it anymore. And I took a small step forward, not to close the distance completely, but enough to show I was not retreating either, enough to meet him somewhere in the middle of whatever this was becoming. And my voice came out steadier than before. Choosing once does not mean I keep choosing it. And something shifted again, subtle but real, like the balance between us adjusted in response. And he tilted his head slightly, studying me with that same focused attention. But this time it felt different, less like I was being read and more like I was being understood, or at least considered. And the silence stretched between us, but it was not uncomfortable anymore. It felt like space, like something that allowed both of us to stand in it without pushing, and I realized then that this was the first moment since the night began where I did not feel like I was being pulled, where I was actually standing still, making a decision instead of reacting to one. And I let that settle for a second before speaking again, my voice quieter now, but clear. If I stay, it is not because I have to, and I held his gaze as I said it, not challenging, not defiant, just honest. And he did not interrupt, did not correct, just listened. And after a moment he nodded once, slow, acknowledging the statement without taking it away, and that small gesture shifted something in me more than anything else, because it meant this was not just control, not just him deciding, and me following. It meant there was space for something else, something I had not expected to find here. And I exhaled slowly, my shoulders dropping just slightly as the tension eased in a way that felt real this time, not temporary, and I glanced toward the window briefly, the rain still falling outside, softer now, almost steady enough to blend into the background, and the parking lot was empty again, quiet, like nothing had happened, like the night had already started to move on, but I knew. Better, I could feel it, the shift that had already taken place, and when I looked back at him, he was still watching me, but his expression had changed, not dramatically, just enough to notice, like something in his focus had softened, not weaker, not less controlled, just different, and he spoke again, his voice lower now, almost reflective. This is not a world you step into halfway, and I felt that land, because it made sense, because everything about tonight had been all or nothing, every choice, every moment, and I nodded slowly, understanding that more than I wanted to admit, and I took another breath, deeper this time, steadying myself as I let the reality settle in, and I spoke again, my voice calm despite everything. Then I do not step into it for you. And that was important, that distinction, that line, and he held my gaze, unflinching, and for a moment I thought he might push back, might challenge it, but instead he nodded again, just slightly, and there was something in that movement that felt like agreement, not full, not complete, but enough, and the space between us shifted again, not closing, not opening, just settling into something new, something neither of us had planned, and I realized then that this was no longer about the night, no longer about what had happened outside or what might happen next. This was about what we were building in this moment, something defined not just by his world or mine, but by the way we were choosing to stand in it together, even if neither of us had said that out loud yet. And I let that thought settle, not fully formed, not fully understood, but present, and I looked at him again, my voice quieter now, almost steady. What happens now? And this time the question did not feel like fear. It felt like direction, like I was ready to hear the answer instead of avoiding it. And he stepped back just slightly, not retreating, just creating space again, his gaze still on me as he spoke, calm, certain. We moved forward, and the simplicity of it made something in my chest shift, because it was not complicated, not layered, just a statement of fact, and I nodded once, feeling that settle into me in a way that felt real, and as the silence returned, softer now, steadier, I understood. Something I had not been ready to admit before. This was no longer just his world or mine. It was something in between, and whatever came next, I was no longer standing outside of it. The moment you stop looking back is the moment everything changes. His words stayed with me even after the silence returned, settling into the quiet of the room like something meant to echo long after they were spoken, and I stood there for a second, letting them sink in, feeling the shift they carried, because up until now, I had still been holding on to something behind me, some version of my life that I thought I could return to if I just made the right decision, if I just stepped carefully enough. But standing here, looking at him, I realized that version was already gone, not destroyed, not taken, just out of reach, like a place I could remember but not step back into. And I exhaled slowly, my arms falling to my sides as I let go of the tension I had been holding on to all night. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to feel the difference. Enough to recognize that I was no longer standing in the same place I had been when this started, and I glanced toward the window again. The rain still falling, steady, quiet now, almost calming in a way that felt out of place for everything else that had happened, and the parking lot remained empty. No trace of the car, no sign of anything that had brought us here. And it struck me then how quickly everything could disappear on the surface while still leaving something behind underneath, something permanent, something that did not fade just because the moment passed. And I turned back to him slowly, my voice quieter now, but steadier than before. How long does this last? And I was not just asking about tonight, not just about the people outside or the situation that had followed us here. I was asking about everything, about the shift, about the change, about what it meant to step into something like this and not look back. And he watched me for a second, his gaze steady, thoughtful in a way that felt different again, like he was considering the question instead of answering it immediately. And then he spoke, calm, measured. It does not end. It becomes part of you. And I felt that settle into me, not as fear, not even as resistance, but as understanding, because it made sense in a way I could not argue with, because I could already feel it. The way tonight had changed something in me. The way I was standing differently, thinking differently, seeing things I would not have noticed before, and I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him, because there was no point in denying it anymore. And I took a step forward, not closing the space completely, but enough to feel like I was choosing it this time, not being pulled into it, and my voice came out steady, clear, then I need to understand it. And that was new, that shift from reacting to learning, from surviving to stepping forward, and something in his expression changed again, subtle but real, like he had been waiting for that, like he recognized it. And he nodded once, slow, acknowledging the shift without pushing it further. And for a moment we just stood there, the silence between us no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, but filled with something else, something that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end of something else. And I realized then that this was the first time since the night began that I was not waiting for something to happen. I was ready for it. And I moved past him slightly, heading toward the kitchen without thinking, my body falling back into motion as my mind caught up, reaching for the kettle, filling it with water, something simple, something grounding, and I set it on the stove, the small, familiar sound of it clicking into place, bringing a sense of normalcy that felt almost strange now, like I was stepping between two worlds, instead of leaving one for the other. And I glanced back at him, leaning lightly against the counter as I watched him, really watched him this time, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as someone standing in the same space as me, someone who had crossed into my life just as much as I had crossed into his. And I spoke again, softer now, but more direct. What happens when they come back? And he did not hesitate this time. His answer immediate, they will not come the same way, and that made sense, because nothing about tonight had been simple. Nothing had followed a straight line, and I nodded slightly, absorbing that, processing it. And I looked down for a second, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the counter as I thought, before looking back up at him, my voice steady. Then I do not stay the same either. And that was it. That was the shift fully realized. The acknowledgement that this was not something I could stand still inside, not something I could experience without changing. And he watched me for a second, longer this time. And then he nodded again, not just acknowledgement, but something closer to agreement, and the space between us settled into something new again, something steadier, something that did not feel like tension anymore. And as the kettle began to hum softly, the sound filling the room, I realized something I had not expected. I was not afraid of what came next, not in the way I should have been, not in the way I had been at the start of the night. And that realization stayed with me as I poured the water, as I handed him a cup without thinking, as I leaned back against the counter again, because it meant something had changed in me, something I could not undo even if I wanted to. And as I looked at him, standing there, calm, steady, like he had always been part of this space, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost quiet. This was not about being pulled into his world anymore. This was about building something new between us, something neither of us had planned, but both of us were already standing inside. Some nights do not end. They become the beginning of everything. The words formed in my mind before I realized I believed them, before I understood that this night had already crossed into something permanent, and I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, the soft hum of the kettle fading into the background as the world outside settled into stillness. The rain now a distant rhythm against the windows, no longer urgent, no longer warning, just present. And I wrapped my hands around the warmth of the cup, letting it ground me, letting it remind me that I was still here, still myself, even as everything else had shifted. And I looked at him again, Adrian, standing across from me like he had always belonged in this space. Like this was not the first time we had stood like this, facing each other in a moment that felt heavier than it should have been. And I realized then that the tension from earlier had changed. It was not gone, but it had transformed into something quieter, something deeper, something that did not push us apart, but held us in place. Like we were both aware that stepping away now would mean losing something we had not even defined yet. And I exhaled slowly, my voice softer than before but steady, almost certain, This was not supposed to happen, and he watched me for a second, his expression unreadable but focused, like he was listening to more than just the words, like he was understanding the weight behind them. And then he answered, calm, simple. It already did, and that was the truth of it, unavoidable, undeniable. And I nodded slightly, feeling that settle into me in a way that did not feel like resistance anymore, just acceptance of what was already real. And I moved a step closer without thinking, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to feel like I was no longer standing apart from him, no longer observing this from the outside. And I spoke again, quieter now, but clearer than before. What happens when morning comes? And that question carried everything, not just the next few hours, but what came after, what came beyond this night, beyond the rain, beyond the moment that had brought us together. And he held my gaze, steady, unflinching. And for a second I thought he might give me another answer that sounded like a truth, but left space for interpretation. But instead he stepped closer, just enough to shift the space between us again, just enough to make it clear that this was not something distant, not something abstract, and his voice dropped slightly, more direct now. Everything becomes real, and I felt that land in a way nothing else had, because it was not a warning, it was not a promise, it was simply what would happen. And I let out a slow breath, my eyes dropping for a second as I processed that, as I understood what it meant to carry this into daylight, into a world that had not seen what I had seen, had not felt what I had felt. And when I looked back up at him, something in me had settled, something that no longer needed to question whether this was real or not, because it was, and it would stay that way. And I nodded once, small but certain, then I do not go back. And that was not fear, not loss, it was acknowledgement. And he watched me for a moment longer before nodding slightly in return, like he understood exactly what I meant without needing anything else. And the silence that followed felt different again, not heavy, not uncertain, but full, like it carried everything we had said and everything we had not. And I moved past him slowly, setting the empty cup down on the counter, my fingers lingering there for a second before I turned back, because something in me did not want to end this moment, did not want to break whatever had formed between us. And I spoke again, softer now, almost reflective. You said they will watch, and he nodded once, and I continued, then they will see me standing. And that was it, the final shift, the moment where I was no longer reacting to what had happened, no longer trying to understand it from the outside, but stepping fully into it. And something in his expression changed again, subtle but unmistakable, like he recognized that, like he had been waiting for it. And he stepped closer one last time, the distance between us narrowing to something that felt intentional, not forced. And his voice was quiet now, almost a statement meant only for me. Then they will learn. And the words settled between us, simple, but carrying more weight than anything else that had been said. And I held his gaze, not looking away, not stepping back, because for the first time since the night began, I was not trying to find a way out. I was choosing where to stand. And as the rain finally slowed to a soft whisper against the windows, as the night settled into something calm and steady, I understood something with absolute clarity. He may have ruled his world before tonight, but now, in this moment, in this space we had created together, I was no longer just someone who had been pulled into it. I was someone who could change it, and that was where everything truly began.